So, if you look at almost any billboard today, or, if you just scroll through your social media feed for like 5 seconds, you're going to be bombarded by one very specific, relentless message.
Oh, absolutely. It is literally everywhere.
Right. It's this idea that ultimate freedom, like the absolute pinnacle of being a fully realized, authentic human being, is found by looking deep inside yourself, discovering your rawest, most unfiltered desires, and just following them wherever they lead.
Yeah, it's essentially the defining dogma of our era. The cultural shorthand usually sounds like live your truth or follow your heart.
Exactly.
We treat this premise as this unquestionable moral good, this assumption that the self is basically a perfectly calibrated compass. And if you simply follow where that internal needle points, the prevailing logic suggests you will inevitably arrive at happiness and authenticity.
And conversely, if you restrict those desires, if you put a lid on them or submit them to some external rule book, modern culture tells you that you're being
Right,
repressed.
you're supposedly living a lie.
Yeah, you're sacrificing your authenticity for someone else's comfort. We frame this uninhibited pursuit of personal appetite as the ultimate psychological breakthrough of the 21st century.
Which, makes what we are doing today incredibly disruptive. Because we're looking at a stack of linguistic analyses, historical sociology papers, and systemic commentaries that are all entirely focused on deconstructing one specific ancient text.
And what a text it is.
Yeah, and this text diagnoses that exact modern mindset, this worship of the unpiloted appetite, not as liberation, but as the foundational recipe for civilizational collapse.
Which is wild. So today's deep dive is going to completely upend that whole live your truth expectation. We are looking at Surah Al-Qasas, Ayat 50. That is chapter 28, verse 50 of the Quran.
A really foundational piece of source material.
Absolutely. Let me just drop the translation of the verse right here so we have our anchor for this entire conversation. It states, "If they do not respond to you, know that they only follow their desires, and who is more astray than one who follows his desire without guidance from God?"
Now, before anyone hears that and assumes we are about to deliver some theological sermon or get into mystical preaching, let's be crystal clear about our mission today.
Yeah, we are absolutely not doing that.
No. We are stripping away the religious sentimentality entirely. We are going to analyze this verse like master sociologists and systems engineers looking at the blueprints of human behavior.
I love that approach.
Because, well, the commentaries and socio-economic frameworks we're pulling from today treat this text fundamentally as a manual on civilizational survival.
And that's really the most fascinating part of this research for me. The deepest error diagnosed in this verse isn't wickedness or evil in some, spooky supernatural cartoon villain sense.
Right, it's not a morality play.
Exactly. The critical structural error being pointed out is the unpiloted appetite. It is the act of decision-making with absolutely no external reference frame.
Yeah, and to set the stage rationally here, we have to look at the immediate context. Historically, this specific verse was addressing people who were actively objecting to a new, equitable systemic structure being presented to them.
Uh-huh.
But the core principle being laid out is entirely universal, and it functions like a law of physics. The text is making a structural argument about human autonomy.
Right, about how an autonomous agent actually operates.
Exactly. If an autonomous agent, a human being, rejects an evidence-based, rational, external structure for their behavior, they don't just magically float in this state of neutral, objective logic.
They immediately default to following their own raw, uncalibrated animal appetites.
Yes, invariably.
So it's like you either have a map or you are at the mercy of the gravitational pull of your own biology. There's no magical middle ground where you're just hovering in pure, unbiased intellect.
You're either steering by the stars or you're drifting with the current.
And what this source material argues layer by layer is that navigating purely by that internal current isn't authenticity. It's actually a structural failure.
It's a navigational collapse, one that inevitably leads to the ruin of the individual and, eventually, the entire society.
Now, to really grasp the sheer scale of the disaster that comes from following these unpiloted desires, we first need to define what those desires actually are.
We have to strip away the poetry.
Yeah, the poetry and the romance we usually attach to human longing, right? And we need to look at the hard, cold biology of what it means to be human. Because the research we're analyzing breaks down the human-animal ratio in a way that is, frankly, profoundly humbling.
It really is a startling assertion, especially for a culture that likes to view itself as highly elevated and rational.
Oh, for sure.
The sociological and biological framework applied to this text states that, structurally speaking, a human being is essentially 95% animal.
95%. I mean, that leaves a remarkably small margin for error.
It does. The vast majority of our physical being, our neurological wiring, and our foundational drives are entirely indistinguishable from the rest of the animal kingdom. We are driven by these ancient, powerful instincts.
So what's the other 5%?
Well, only a tiny fraction, that remaining 5%, metaphorically speaking, represents what the linguistic and philosophical analyses refer to as the distinct human personality, or in the original terminology, the kuti.
Okay, let's unpack cootie for a second, because that is a massive concept in these commentaries. We aren't just talking about having, like, a sparkling personality or a good sense of humor, right?
No, not at all.
Cootie is the integrated self. It's the capacity for conscious, deliberate choice. I mean, it is the part of you that can observe a stimulus, feel the massive urge to respond, and then decide to do something else entirely.
Precisely. The kuti is the seat of self-awareness and moral agency. It's really the only thing that separates us from a purely mechanistic stimulus-response loop.
Right.
But the crucial thing to remember is that this kuti is riding on top of a massive, roaring engine of animal biology. And to understand how that engine works, the source material breaks down 3 foundational, biologically hardwired drives.
The drives that fuel that 95% of our nature.
Exactly.
Well, let's walk through those 3 drives, because once you see them, you kind of start to recognize them as the invisible architecture behind almost every human conflict.
Oh, absolutely. The first one is the absolute baseline of biology, the preservation of self.
Right, the drive to survive.
Yes, to maintain the physical integrity of the organism. And the framework we're looking at points out that this drive isn't just a psychological desire. It exists at every single level of biological life.
It's cellular.
Exactly. The text uses the example of simple organisms. If you take single-celled organisms, simple bacteria, put them under a microscope, and introduce a toxic chemical into their environment, they react.
Even without a brain. Like, without a central nervous system, they fight or flee. They physically move away from the toxin.
Because the drive for self-preservation is baked into the very definition of physical life. An ant will bite a human a million times its size to defend its life.
Yeah, your own immune system fights off pathogens without your conscious permission. The organism just wants to live.
Which is an evolutionary imperative. Without that aggressive drive to survive, life ends in a single generation. And that transitions perfectly into the second foundational drive.
Reproduction.
Right, the drive to continue the species.
So self-preservation keeps the individual alive today, and reproduction keeps the genetic line alive tomorrow?
Both are incredibly potent, chemically reinforced imperatives. But it's the third drive where the system really starts to generate extreme friction, especially when we start looking at complex societies.
And that third drive is self-aggression. Or, the drive for dominance.
The drive to overpower your environment and others to secure your own survival.
Right, because if I'm in a forest and resources are scarce, my biology dictates that I need to make sure I get the food, the shelter, and the mates. And logically, that means you don't?
Dominance is the inevitable manifestation of the first 2 drives operating in a competitive, finite environment. To preserve myself and ensure my reproduction, I cannot just passively exist.
You have to dominate.
I must dominate my surroundings. I must secure territory. I must hoard resources to insulate myself against future scarcity. And in the animal kingdom, this isn't viewed as malicious or evil.
No, it's simply the reality of the food chain.
Exactly. But nature didn't just build these incredibly powerful, aggressive biological engines and let them run wild without a governance system.
This is where it gets super interesting. The sociological texts we're reviewing point out this brilliant piece of systems design in nature, the built-in safety valves.
Yes. In the animal kingdom, these massive drives are perfectly capped by natural physiological controls. Animals possess absolute limiters. Take a lion, for example.
An apex predator.
A creature of terrifying power and aggression. But when does a lion actually hunt?
Well, it only hunts when its biochemistry tells it that it's hungry.
Right. A lion does not kill a gazelle, eat its fill, and then decide to go slaughter the rest of the herd just to build a massive stockpile of rotting meat.
Yeah, it doesn't try to establish a monopoly on the savannah.
No. It doesn't kill out of a desire for infinite accumulation or abstract status. Once its stomach is full, the hormonal drive to kill is literally switched off. The safety valve engages.
Yeah.
You could walk past a lion with a full stomach and it might just watch you lazily.
And we see the exact same thing with the reproductive drive, right? Like, A bull has immense physical power and reproductive instinct, but it only mates during specific biologically dictated seasons.
Yes.
An animal doesn't eat until its stomach bursts. The instincts in the animal kingdom are staggeringly powerful, but they have a hard, unyielding ceiling. The animal cannot override its own safety valve.
And this brings us to the terrifying anomaly of the human condition, which is the core problem diagnosed by the verse we are analyzing. Humans have those exact same three drives: self-preservation, reproduction, and dominance burning inside us.
But in humans, the biological safety valves have been removed.
Exactly. We have the 95% animal engine, but the physical governors have been uninstalled. We are essentially limitless apex predators.
Wow. Limitless apex predators. The commentaries point this out with a really chilling comparison of scale.
They do. A lion, driven by instinct, might take down a single animal to satisfy its hunger. But a human being, driven by the unchecked desire for dominance and security, can invent an atomic weapon, drop it on a city like Hiroshima, and annihilate hundreds of thousands of people in a fraction of a second.
Because there is no natural biological full point for human desire. I mean, a human being can eat until they are physically sick.
Right.
A human can hoard enough wealth to feed a small nation while their immediate neighbors literally starve to death. And that human will still feel this overwhelming urge to acquire more. The biological off switch simply does not exist in our psyche.
It's a terrifying reality when you look at it systemically.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here, because
Yeah.
the most obvious counterargument is just screaming to be heard.
Let's hear it.
We aren't just biological eating and mating machines. We have the prefrontal cortex. We have reason. We have this massive, highly evolved intellect that allows us to do calculus, build skyscrapers, and understand abstract morality.
Right.
So doesn't our intellect act as our built-in safety valve? It seems like we traded biological limiters for cognitive ones. Isn't reason the brakes on this out-of-control vehicle?
That is the most intuitive assumption to make. We want to believe that if people are just educated enough or smart enough, their reason will automatically temper their greed.
Right. Education solves everything, supposedly.
But the systemic analysis of this text dismantles that assumption completely. The intellect, according to this framework, is emphatically not the brakes.
So if my massive human brain isn't the brakes, what function is it actually serving in this vehicle?
The intellect is simply a highly advanced, ultra-efficient navigation system for the engine of desire.
Wait, so it doesn't stop the car. It just calculates the fastest, most efficient route to whatever the engine wants.
Precisely. This is what philosophers sometimes call instrumental rationality. Human reason, when left entirely to its own devices without any external standard of right and wrong to calibrate it, does not naturally restrict the animal instincts.
It doesn't say, you have enough wealth, you should stop.
No, instead, it becomes the ultimate tool to satisfy those instincts more efficiently, more broadly, and on a much grander scale.
Man, that is a deeply unsettling realization. If my raw animal instinct demands satisfaction, say, the drive for dominance and the accumulation of resources, my uncalibrated intellect doesn't step in to play moral referee.
Doesn't.
My intellect just says, okay, boss, you want more. Let's figure out how to get more without getting caught, without getting hurt, and with maximum efficiency.
And the historical and sociological examples of this are literally everywhere.
Yeah.
How does the uncalibrated intellect serve the appetite? A baseline animal instinct says, take that. The human intellect refines it.
It invents smuggling networks. It invents complex corporate fraud.
Yes. A lion just bites you to take your territory. A human being uses their genius-level intellect to invent a collateralized debt obligation,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
packaging toxic mortgages to steal the life savings of thousands of people from half a world away, all while wearing a bespoke suit and staying perfectly within the bounds of a legal loophole they lobbied to create.
That is the perfect illustration of instrumental rationality. The intellect didn't stop the predatory drive, it just sanitized it.
It made it invisible, systemic, and infinitely more destructive. And this dynamic inevitably leads to what the source commentaries describe as the ultimate battle of wits in human society.
The battle of wits. This is what happens when a society tries to govern itself using nothing but human reason, without an external moral compass. We look around, see people doing destructive things, and we say, okay, let's use our intellect to write a law to stop them.
But because the foundational nature of the human hasn't changed, because the intellect of the population is still completely subservient to their desires, the implementation of that law just triggers an arms race.
Right. The human reason of the lawmakers creates a barrier. and the human reason of the individuals immediately goes to work calculating a way around it.
The police get better forensic technology, so the criminals get better at covering their tracks.
The tax authority writes a 1,000-page code to stop evasion, and the accountants just find 1,001 loopholes.
It is a systemic arms race of intellects serving their appetites.
Yeah.
And the terrifying corollary to this is that the smarter the individual, the more catastrophic the crime.
Yeah, a person with average intelligence and unchecked desires might embezzle a few $1,000s from a local business.
But a person with genius-level intelligence and unchecked desires can manipulate global markets, destabilize national economies, and plunge millions into poverty. The intellect amplifies the destruction of the appetite. It does not cure it.
Which brings us to the historical apex of this specific error. The commentaries tie this entire dynamic directly back to the specific context of Surah Al-Qasas by bringing up the figure of the pharaoh.
Yes, the pharaoh.
Now, for most of us, when we hear pharaoh, we just picture a guy in a gold headdress who built pyramids and oppressed people. Like, he's just a generic historical bad guy.
Right, a cartoon villain.
But the systemic analysis we are reading frames pharaoh completely differently. It argues that pharaoh represents an entire epistemology.
And just to clarify, an epistemology is a foundational theory of knowledge. It's the framework we use to determine what is true, what is valid, and what is real.
So the text highlights Pharaoh's infamous historical claim, "I know of no God but me." The sociological reading of this insists we shouldn't just view this as the typical arrogance of a monarch. We need to view this as the ultimate declaration of state policy.
It is raw desire. The Arabic word is Hawa elevated to the highest law of the land.
So what is the system of the pharaoh essentially declaring?
It's declaring the self is the only valid reference point. There is no objective standard of justice, equity, or truth above the ruler's intellect. There is no external metric.
Right.
Whatever the sovereign desires is, by definition, the law of physics for that symbiety.
It's solipsism with a military. And if we extrapolate that mindset, the idea that the self is the only God, the only arbiter of truth, and we connect it to the modern cultural moment we started with, you see the exact same architecture.
It's identical.
The live your truth mentality is simply the democratization of the pharaoh's epistemology. If there's no external, evidence-grounded standard of what is beneficial or destructive, the concept of good simply collapses into whatever I currently want.
And that collapse is historically catastrophic. Because if good is defined strictly as what I desire, then anyone or anything that stands in the way of my desire is, by definition, bad.
This is the exact rationalization used by every tyrant in human history. Tyrants rarely wake up and decide to be evil. They simply operate from a framework where their desires and the ultimate good are perfectly synonymous.
And it isn't just a phenomenon at the top of the political pyramid. It is the exact same logic that fuels chaotic mobs at the bottom.
Oh, absolutely. A mob burns down a neighborhood or destroys a community because they collectively feel that their immediate desire for retribution or their expression of anger overrides any external law or standard of justice.
The dictator in the palace and the rioter in the street are operating on the exact same unpiloted operating system. The self measuring the self.
It is the intellect, completely captured by the animal drive for dominance, operating in a vacuum without a single limitation line in sight.
Now, humanity isn't completely blind. Historically, philosophers, thinkers, and societies have recognized this problem. They've looked at the wreckage caused by unchecked human appetites, the wars, the hoarding, the exploitation, and they have desperately tried to engineer solutions.
But the source material outlines how, without the right foundational map, human philosophy split into two massive, disastrous extremes trying to solve the problem of the destructive human appetite.
The commentaries track this philosophical divergence with remarkable precision. Because the destruction caused by unbridled desire is so glaring, thinkers had to respond. So let's look at the first massive divergence. The texts identify this as the path of materialism or secularism.
Extreme number one. The source traces the roots of this back to the Epicurean philosophy of ancient Greece, but it's very clear that this is essentially the dominant default operating system of the modern, globalized world today.
The foundational axiom of this extreme is that life is exclusively physical. It's entirely biological and material. According to this framework, you are born as a biological accident, you live your span of years, you die, and the component parts of your body simply disintegrate back into the carbon cycle.
Right.
There is no higher purpose, no enduring consequence beyond the immediate physical realm, and no continuous human personality that survives the physical machinery.
It is the ultimate manifestation of you only live once. YOLO translated into a geopolitical and macroeconomic doctrine.
And if you genuinely fundamentally believe that life is strictly physical and temporary, what is the most logical, rational way to live it?
I mean, you maximize the physical pleasure. You grab as much as you can, as fast as you can, because the clock is ticking and there is nothing else.
Exactly. The human intellect calculates that since the physical appetites are all that exist, satisfying them efficiently is the highest possible good.
Which leads to a societal architecture built entirely around hyperconsumption, dominance, and the relentless competitive pursuit of comfort and power.
Which the systemic analysis argues leads directly to the widespread societal ruin, the environmental degradation, and the staggering global inequality we're grappling with right now.
Yeah, if 8 billion people are all operating as ungoverned apex predators, trying to maximize their own physical desires in a finite world with finite resources, the inevitable mathematical result is a world tearing itself apart to feed its appetites.
Now, seeing the devastation, the cruelty, and the emptiness caused by that extreme materialism, a second group of thinkers historically reacted. And, as is often the case with human philosophy, they didn't just course-correct, they swung the pendulum violently in the complete opposite direction.
This brings us to extreme number 2. The texts label this mysticism, asceticism, or monastic retreat.
Yeah.
And it lists a whole spectrum of traditions across the globe that adopted this approach. Greek ascetics, early Buddhist philosophies, Vedantic traditions, various Christian mystic orders, and certain Sufi movements.
These groups looked at the horror of the world, the wars fought for resources, the greed, the destructive lust, and they correctly identified that unchecked human desires were the fuel for the fire.
But their proposed solution was radical. They concluded that the biological desires themselves were inherently evil, or at the very least an illusion that needed to be escaped.
So their goal wasn't to manage the desires or build a system to channel them. Their goal was to completely extinguish them.
The philosophy of killing the self,
Yeah.
renouncing the material world entirely.
Yes. This manifested as taking vows of absolute poverty, engaging in extreme fasting to punish the body, remaining celibate, or isolating oneself in caves, monasteries, or the wilderness.
Right. The fundamental idea was that to achieve purity, peace, or spiritual elevation, you had to crush the animal part of yourself out of existence.
Which is such a flawed piece of engineering logic.
It really is. It's like realizing your car is going too fast and causing accidents, and instead of learning how to use a steering wheel or establish traffic laws, your solution is to just detonate the engine.
Exactly.
Sure, you're not speeding anymore, but you're also not a functioning vehicle. You're just a pile of scrap metal sitting on the side of the road.
The source texts we are studying are incredibly critical of this ascetic approach. They argue fundamentally that trying to suppress, deny, or kill the biological instincts is a profound systemic error.
Because those desires are not evil. That is the massive paradigm shift here. The desires themselves are morally neutral engines of energy.
Precisely. The drive for self-preservation, the drive for reproduction, the drive to secure resources, these are the essential engines of life, human progression, and civilization.
They are the energy that builds cities, advances science, and sustains families. You cannot kill the appetites without killing life itself.
The psychological analysis within these commentaries points out that when you try to force the destruction of these natural drives through extreme asceticism, biology fights back. It leads to severe psychological neuroses.
The mechanism of this is really well documented in psychology, right? When you dam up a powerful river completely, the water doesn't just politely disappear.
No, it builds up immense pressure, it stagnates, and eventually it explodes outward in destructive, unnatural ways. We see this historically in institutions that demand absolute, lifelong suppression of natural drives.
It frequently results in profound psychological damage, shadow behaviors, and hidden abuses. You just cannot successfully war against your own biology.
So we are stuck in a seemingly impossible paradox. We can't let the desires run wild because they lack safety valves and turn us into limitless, destructive monsters who consume the earth.
But we can't kill the desires because that destroys human life, stalls civilization, and causes massive psychological damage. So
Right.
if we can't let them loose and we can't kill them, What is the third option? What is the systemic solution?
This brings us all the way back to the foundational text we started with, Surah Al-Qasas, Ayat 50. To understand the solution, the commentaries take us into a brilliant linguistic and structural dissection of the verse itself.
We have to look at the exact Arabic words used to describe this problem of systemic navigation. Let's dive into the linguistics, because this is where the genius of the text really reveals itself.
Absolutely.
The verse explicitly contrasts two concepts, Hawa and Huda. Let's start with the first one, Hawa. The verse criticized those who only follow their desires, and the word used for those desires is Hawa, which is the plural of Hawa. What is the literal etymological root of that word?
The literal Arabic root of Hawa means to fall, to drop down from a height.
To fall. Wow, that is an incredibly evocative visual metaphor.
It perfectly captures the mechanics of impulse. It represents the gravitational pull toward whatever gratifies the self right in this immediate moment. Think about how gravity works. It is an undeniable, relentless downward pull.
Right.
When a human being acts purely on biological impulse, grabbing whatever satisfies their immediate hunger, lust, or anger without any higher consideration, they are essentially giving in to the gravity of their base animal nature.
They are falling.
And the most dangerous aspect of Hawa, which the source commentaries emphasize heavily, is that it is a completely closed system.
Yeah.
If I'm navigating my life by only following my Hawa, my desires, then the self is referring only to the self.
Exactly.
I ask myself what I want, I tell myself what I want, and then I judge the success of my actions based entirely on whether I got what I wanted. There is no outside data, no objective reality entering the loop. It's the ultimate intellectual echo chamber. Now, contrast that closed system with the second crucial word in the pair, Huda. The verse asks, rhetorically, who is more astray than one who follows his desire without guidance from God? The word for guidance there is Huda.
So how do these sociological texts define Huda?
Huda is defined as an external tested reference standard. It is the map. It is the compass. It is the fixed stars by which you navigate.
It is the open system.
Exactly. In an open system, the self is calibrated against a standard of knowledge that exists outside of its own immediate gratification. It is a set of objective coordinates, permanent values that you can use to measure your position, regardless of how you happen to feel about your position in that moment.
And the final word in that linguistic trio perfectly ties this all together into a unified theory of behavior. Aslalu. The translation says, who is more astray, translating the word aslalu.
The linguistic analysis points out that aslalu is pure, literal navigation language. It means to lose the way, to wander off the path, to be completely disoriented and lost in the desert.
So if we put the whole linguistic equation together, the text is giving us a formula. To follow Hawa, which is the gravitational, self-referential pull of the animal engine, without Huda, which is the external, objective reference map, is to steer a massive ship in the dark with no compass and proudly call your aimless drifting freedom.
And this is where the socio-economic framework completely reframes our modern concept of religion or divine instruction.
This is a huge pivot.
It is. The Quranic system, as analyzed in these extensive commentaries, does not ask you to destroy your desires like the ascetics do. It certainly doesn't let them run wild like the materialists do. Instead, it provides the Huda, the structural boundaries, or what the text beautifully translate as the limitation lines.
Limitation lines. I love that concept. It's like the painted lines on a multi-lane highway. The lines don't stop the car. They don't shut down the engine.
No, not at all.
They simply tell the high-powered vehicle where it can safely travel at top speed without causing a massive pileup.
That is the exact mechanism. The biological instincts are the fuel. The human intellect is the steering wheel. The Huda, the permanent values, are the lines on the road. Satisfying your biological desires within these external parameters is the ultimate goal.
And when you do that, the framework argues you fundamentally transform human existence. You are no longer functioning at the base reactionary animal state of pure instinct. You elevate yourself, developing that kuti, that human personality. You master the animal engine within rather than being dragged around by it.
Now, implementing this requires a massive fundamental shift in how we think about the word religion.
Yeah.
The sociologists and commentators we're reading stress this point heavily. To understand how these limitation lines work on a societal level, we have to introduce the concept of deen.
This is a critical distinction. The source material draws a sharp line between a conventional religion of forced rituals, private beliefs, and priestly classes, and the concept of deen, which it defines as a comprehensive, socio-economic, state-level system of life based on permanent values.
And here is the absolutely critical part regarding human freedom. If these limitation lines, these rules of society, are simply forced onto a population, if they're superimposed by a dictator, a king, or a theocracy using a brutal police force, the system ultimately fails.
Because superimposed law just creates rebellion, hypocrisy, and eventually revolution.
Exactly, because a superimposed law acts on a human being from the outside, like an iron cage. The animal instinct is still raging, uncalibrated inside the individual, just waiting for the cage door to rust or open.
Right.
True Dean, true civilizational health, only emerges when individuals rationally recognize the validity of the external standard. They look at the Huda, they analyze it with their intellect, they see empirically that it's the only way to prevent mutual destruction and ensure equity, and they willingly adopt it for their own actualization.
They don't obey the speed limit out of terror that a cop is hiding behind the billboard. They obey the speed limit because they have read the map, they understand the physics of the road, and they know exactly where the cliff is. They internalize the limitation lines.
The external law becomes their internal logic.
And that internalization is what creates a stable, thriving civilization. But this naturally raises the next logical question, one that skeptics always ask.
What happens if you don't?
Exactly. What happens when a society, a corporation, or an individual insists on steering entirely by their own uncalibrated desires? Do they face a magical punishment? Does a lightning bolt come out of the sky to strike them down?
This brings us to a massive concept in the literature, the law of requital, or in the specific terminology of the text, mukafat amal. To understand this, the commentators point us right back to the phrasing of the verse we've been analyzing. Who is more astray?
Notice the phrasing there. It doesn't say who is more likely to be tortured. It says who is more astray.
The literature insists vehemently that this is a statement about outcomes, not a threat of mystical arbitrary vengeance from an angry deity. It is a description of objective cause and effect.
The law of requital is built directly into the navigation metaphor. It is the physics of decision-making.
If you're the captain of a ship and you decide to steer across the Pacific Ocean by referencing nothing but your own momentary whim, I feel like turning left today because the clouds look nice. I feel like turning right tomorrow because I'm bored. You do not need a magical sea monster to come up from the depths and destroy your ship as a punishment for your hubris.
You simply arrive somewhere ruinous. You slam into a reef. You run out of fresh water in the middle of nowhere. You sail into a hurricane.
Uncalibrated choices, biologically and socially, accumulate into a wrecked trajectory. The punishment is baked into the action itself. The agent who pilots their life, or the CEO who pilots their company, or the politician who pilots their nation by pure desire reliably, mathematically, ends up lost and destroyed.
The destruction isn't an external penalty layered on top of the action. It is the natural, unavoidable destination of a fundamentally bad trajectory.
To illustrate this destructive process on a psychological level, the texts use a very stark, almost disturbing metaphor from another part of the Quran, Surah 7, comparing the human being who violently discards these external boundaries to a snake shedding its skin.
It is a profound psychological image. When a human being is presented with the Huda, the external reference map of permanent values, equity, and justice, and they actively choose to slow it off, to discard it completely so they can follow the gravity of their Hawa, the text says they are like a snake wiggling out of its skin to slide on its belly.
The implication of that metaphor is brutal for the live your truth crowd. When you shed those external moral boundaries, you aren't freeing your true, authentic self. You are actively shedding your humanity. You are reverting to the 95% animal.
The text literally says that such a person clings to the earth. They become entirely bound to the dirt, to the base, physical, territorial instincts. They completely forget the path of elevation, the upward trajectory of developing the kuti.
And by clinging to the earth, by acting as a limitless apex predator armed with a genius-level intellect and no safety valves, they ultimately destroy themselves, their environment, and their society. It is a tragic, entirely self-inflicted civilizational collapse.
So if we pull back the lens and synthesize everything we have unpacked today from these socio-economic and linguistic commentaries, we can look at the grand architecture of human history through the lens of this single verse. We can see the interplay of permanence and change.
Well, let's look at the permanent principle first. The underlying physics of human behavior identified here is stark and unyielding. Freedom without a reference standard is just drift. And in any historical era or any social system, the most reliably destroyed actor is the one who mistakes the gravity of their own appetite for an objective compass. That is the permanent rule.
Well, what changes?
The aesthetics change. The superficial details change. The appetites and the intellectual philosophical justifications for those appetites constantly rebrand themselves in every single generation to look modern and sophisticated.
Right. Think about the drive for dominance. 1,000 years ago, the unchecked desire for dominance looked like a warlord riding on horseback with the sword to slaughter a neighboring village and steal their grain and gold.
Yes.
Today, the exact same unpiloted drive looks like a corporate raider executing a hostile takeover, deliberately bankrupting a functional company, laying off 10,000 workers, and stripping the pension assets just to buy a fourth superyacht.
The tools get infinitely sharper. The legal and philosophical frameworks used to justify the greed get sleeker and more complex, but the underlying structural error, a self-referential desire operating with absolutely no external calibration, is a historical constant.
It is genuinely staggering to think about the sheer density of the source material we just walked through. In a single line, Surah Al-Qasas, Ayat 50, this text has diagnosed the root socio-economic, psychological, and structural condition that produces every tyrant and every hoarder in human history.
It diagnoses every pharaoh, representing political and state tyranny, and the epistemology of this self as God. And it also diagnoses every Qarun.
Let's touch on Qarun briefly, because he is the other side of the pharaoh coin in these commentaries. Who is Qarun?
Qarun is another historical archetype mentioned in the same texts. If pharaoh represents unchecked political dominance, Qarun represents ultimate unchecked economic hoarding and capitalist monopoly. He's the archetype of the individual who hoards vast wealth and attributes his success entirely to his own intellect, his own Hawa, refusing to recognize any external obligation to society.
So both pharaoh and Qarun are inevitable systemic products of the exact same navigational error.
Exactly.
So let's bring you, the listener, back to the surface after this deep dive. We started today by looking at the modern myth, this pervasive, billboard-friendly idea that following your desires is the ultimate freedom and the truest expression of who you are.
And by thoroughly dissecting the socioeconomic and structural frameworks around this text, we've seen a completely inverted paradigm. We've seen how a purely self-referential system doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to the battle of wits, the arms race of exploitation, and civilizational collapse.
We've seen how the human intellect, left to its own devices, fails completely to act as a brake and instead accelerates our most destructive drives.
We've realized that you can't just kill the desires through extreme asceticism, because they are the vital engine of human life. The only viable, rational solution for human survival and elevation is the adoption of an external, tested standard of navigation, the Huda.
The limitation lines that allow us to channel our massive, uncapped energy safely and productively.
It is the exact difference between a devastating flash flood and a hydroelectric dam. Both rely entirely on the immense natural power of moving water. But one destroys an entire city while the other powers it, simply because of the intelligent introduction of structural boundaries.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to chew on as we wrap up this exploration. Think about the biggest, most crucial decisions you are facing right now in your own life, your career, or your relationships. When you trace back the ultimate why of your choices, the underlying reason you are moving in a certain direction, are you referencing a map of permanent values that has stood the test of time? Or are you just measuring yourself against yourself?
Because if your only compass is you, how will you know when you're falling?